Welcome to our session on strengthening democracy. We are so excited to have so many people from all over the world with us today. Thank you for joining us. Let's have an exciting and thought-provoking discussion in the next hour or so. My name is Alexandra Ioan. I'm leading the Ashoka Learning and Action Center, a cross-program knowledge and research unit at Ashoka. And I'm very, very delighted to welcome our moderator for the evening, James Fallows, the author and veteran correspondent for The Atlantic. Welcome, James. It's great to have you with us. I also wish to welcome our Ashoka Fellows, who will be the speakers in our discussion. We have with us Elena Calistro from Romania, leading the organization Funky Citizens. We have with us Eric Liu from the United States, leading the Citizen University. And Ronaldo Lemos also joined us from Brazil. He's leading the Institute for Technology and Society. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here with us today. It's a great pleasure to have you here. What will happen during this session? We invite you to do two things. First, to learn from the solutions that the social entrepreneurs will share with us, from their work, from their experiences on democracy and civic engagement. This will be the first part of the session. So please listen carefully, absorb what they have to share with us, because they're working on very, very exciting areas of democracy development around the world. The second part will be focused on how to bring these solutions, and not only these ones, also other ones, how to bring them together. How can we create better formats for collaboration and collective action globally? We see challenges when it comes to democracies around the world that are maybe common. And how can we build on each other's experiences, on each other's expertise in dealing with these challenges? One of the advantages of working at Ashoka is that as a team, we get to see overarching trends and patterns across our networks of innovators and social entrepreneurs. And this includes also the field of democracy solutions. And across very different contexts, we see similarities in what's working. For example, making politics engaging and relatable for citizens, managing the dynamic between offline engagement and online tools, bringing unlikely stakeholders that turn into allies together, or shifting power relations between different social groups. These are all things that we have identified in analyses and studies that we've conducted on the topic of democracy and civic engagement, and that we've seen fellows across the world using in their work. At Ashoka, we also started experimenting with collective impact formats with our Democracy Collective initiative. For example, just last month, we brought together social entrepreneurs and other key stakeholders in Europe in order to help them align on a common purpose and also action plan when it comes to democracy in the future. The second phase of this European pilot is ready to kick off. And we are really looking forward to finding new partners for this, new funders, additional stakeholders that want to get involved, and policymakers as well. And the vision behind this approach is that basically together, collectively, with all of these stakeholders, we can reach this systemic change that we're aiming for, and this true strengthening of democratic societies and systems that we strive for. I'm sure our discussion will touch upon all of these issues and many more. And I invite you to also have a look more closely at our analyses, our reports on the topic. My colleagues will post them in the chat. And I hope by this time, most of the participants that have registered for the session managed to join us. I hope you can hear us and see us well. And I'd definitely like to remind you to be active in this session. Use the chat, post your questions, post your comments, any ideas you might have, wishes for collaboration. This is why we're all here. Our team will be in touch with us throughout the session at all times. So we will definitely find out about your inputs. And at the end, after the main discussion, we will also have some time for Q&A. So please don't be shy in sharing your questions and asking whatever is on your mind. I would like to now pass the virtual mic, so to speak, to James, who will guide us through this next hour and through this very exciting conversation. And I welcome you all once again and wish you a fruitful and fun discussion. James?
Alexandra, thanks so much. Thanks to everybody who is joining us here. Thanks to Ashoka. Thanks to those who have made this summit possible. I think we have a fascinating session coming up with three really well-experienced and gifted participants who are going to tell us about the situations in their own countries. And also, as Alexandra was saying, some of the ways in which patterns can evolve to see how practices that work in Europe and Latin America and North America can be extended, and what we've learned from each other's experience. My role here is going to be to introduce very briefly each of these panelists, because we could spend the entire time we have together just talking about their accomplishments. First, I'm going to ask each of them about the situation in his or her own country and some of the experiences they're involved in there. Then we're going to shift to talking about some larger patterns, ways in which these efforts for democracy preservation, democracy revival can be pooled across the world. And in this, and then we're going to go to questions that from all of you who are part of the summit are sending in. I believe the chat function will be open throughout. That is the way you can send in questions. I'm only going to start paying attention to those about halfway through. So for the first half, I'm going to be just steering our discussants themselves, and then I'll be incorporating these questions as they come in. I'm going to have the introductory round of comments moving in a sort of east to south to west order, hearing first from Europe and then from Latin America and then from the United States about some of the experiences that our three Ashoka Fellows have heard. I'm going to begin with Elena Calistro, who is an Ashoka Fellow since 2019. Her organization in Romania is Funky Citizens, it's called. And one of her specialties there has been developing the muscle of citizen engagement, that of just not thinking this is as is well known by Ashoka, this is not just something that people and societies happen to have or don't, but that can be developed. And there are ways in which the Funky Citizens organization has been very important in trying to build a democratic practice and capability in a society whose experience with it is more recent than, say, that of some other older Western democracies. So, Elena, would you begin by talking to us about the democratic situation in Romania right now? What is the main challenge? And what is the main thing we should know about what Funky Citizens is doing in Romania to address it?
Hello, everybody, on my behalf as well. I think that Romania is one of the optimistic democracies of the world, not only because things got better in the past years, but also because we have managed to somehow become a more mature democracy in the past years. I'm saying this because Romania, like many other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, have a very brief history of democratic practice. We've gained our independence in 1989 with the revolutions, with the end of the Cold War, and we've experienced quite a lot of let's say harsh situations. I must tell you that the only American friend that was really well equipped for what happened in the past years in the US was my friend Chris, who lived in Eastern Europe for a while, and he was like, yeah, this sounds familiar. So it's I think it's sufficient to mention that this part of the world has a rather short history of being a democracy, and this is sometimes making us, let's say, slip backwards when it comes to advancing things like rule of law and good governance and fighting corruption. But the good news about our country is that after 30 years of looking west, and a lot of people, a lot of our fellow citizens living these countries because they couldn't wait for democracy to come to our countries. Some of them regained their spirit and their fighting mood, and put this fighting mood to work. And this is why I would say that even though I still have a lot of things to complain about, this is what I do. I'm a professional troublemaker and a professional complainer. I like to go out and protest on high heels because protesting is for everybody. But even though I complain about a lot of things, I think that the most important gain we've had in these years is that we have realized as a nation that there is hope, that a democracy is not built in just 30 years, that we need to be somehow patient with our institutions, with our countries, and that if we want to have something, we should work a bit for it, because it shouldn't. I think this is the best lesson I've learned in the past years, that it shouldn't be easy, but it can be done when it comes to democratic practice.
Elena, thank you. And I have one follow-up to ask you, which is also then a segue in a way to Ronaldo Lemos and what he'll tell us about Brazil. One of the innovations that, as I understand it, you've pioneered in Romania is a fact-checking system, accountability for public spending, for other public efforts and enterprises. The whole question of establishing facts and having a ground truth of agreed reality is an important one around the world. Tell us a little more about what you've done in this fact-checking realm.
Well, we managed to, of course, we look at what is happening in other countries. It's a classical fact-checking platform, but we usually, bring in a lot of data in the conversation we have with our fellow citizens, and we are trying to educate them on what they can do about various things, whether it's about procurement, and some people find procurement interesting, or it's about going through the legislation and understanding why some things can be done or others cannot be done. I would say that we have managed to build a community around our actions, and we are followed by, and we reach over 3 million people per year. But what we do is that we do not simply deliver facts. As you all know, facts are almost nothing. Even though I'm a geek, I tend to agree with this reality. But we are trying to educate the public about the stories behind those facts, about the stories behind those spreadsheets, about the stories that lead to some dysfunctionalities in our systems, and the way in which we can actually solve them, and the way in which the facts can point to the solution.
Thank you very much. Let me use that as a transition to involving Ronaldo Lemos of Brazil from the Institute of Technology and Society in Rio de Janeiro. And Ronaldo has legal experience, technological experience. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School. He has a visiting professorship at Columbia University. And when it comes to realms of factual knowledge or disinformation, citizen engagement and disengagement, unity and fragmentation, technology has a crucial role, especially information technology. I know that in Brazil, this has been one of your main focuses of an Internet Bill of Rights, et cetera. So, excuse me. Brazil has a different kind of democratic history from either Romania or from the United States. Tell us about how to understand briefly the state of democracy in Brazil now and what you specifically are doing, especially with your internet efforts.
Sure. Thank you, James. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And I think Brazil is a pretty young democracy. This period in history for Brazil starts in 1988 with the new constitution. Brazil before that lived through a military regime, and it transitioned back to democracy basically not too long ago. in spite of being a rather young democracy, I think the experience of Brazil is actually of a vibrant environment in which basically a lot of things have happened in terms of using, for instance, technology and information technology in order to promote participation. So I am personally involved in one of these experiments, one that actually took place between 2007 and 2014, which was basically to build Brazil's internet law. And the interest in this law is not only in terms of the outcome of the law, which I think it's very positive, because it's a landmark legislation, well recognized even outside of Brazil as a legislation that protects free speech, privacy. It protects digitized and transparent government and so on. So it's pretty much a law that is pretty remarkable in terms of the rights that it has protected. But it's also interesting, not only from the substantial part, but also for the process, because the Brazilian law was created as a collaborative effort. So if we remember it, in 2007, we were all still very enthusiastic about the possibilities of using the internet as a sort of a form of participation, of building things together. It was the times of the Wikipedia, open source projects, and the weblogs. So it was a very interesting time of decentralization and also experimentation in terms of participatory and collaborative projects. So at that time, we came together and basically said, why don't we use the internet in order to build Brazil a long overdue legislation to deal with the internet? Or in other words, why don't we build Brazil a Bill of Rights? And the way we did that was by means of creating a platform online open for civic participation. So basically, everyone was welcome to participate, and that is exactly what happened. So it is actually amazing looking from the status of the internet today, how constructive that participation was. And we had contributions from librarians, neighborhood associations, vested interests like telcos, and anyone that was basically touched by the interests that would be regulated by that particular law. They basically came forward, and in a very transparent fashion, they put everything that they had to say about the law in this platform. We took those contributions, turned them into an actual draft of a law, sent it back to the platform for comments once again, and repeated the process over and over again. So in total, it took 7 years to build the Brazilian Bill of Rights. It was a very long consultation project. There are many academic works actually written in English and in Portuguese accounting for how it happened. And in the end, it was probably one of the most debated pieces of legislation maybe ever, and for sure in Brazil, and probably one of the very few that was basically drafted online at the public eye, not behind closed doors, with all the stakeholders basically debating each other. And the beauty of the law is also that there was no winner or losers. Each stakeholder basically won a little bit, lost a little bit. So it was a very balanced piece of legislation. And it was finally sent to the Congress in 2012. And it took still 2 years of more debates inside Congress, but Congress was pretty much very respectful of the text that was drafted like that. And as I said, the law was enacted in 2014, and still today is a pretty good and well-known piece of legislation. So that process, it taught me that it is actually possible to use technology not to destroy, but to promote democracy, not to diminish, but to enhance participatory efforts. And since that experience, I've been involved in quite a few others initiatives that actually use technology in order to enhance participation. And of course, we'll be happy to talk about those as we go along.
Ronaldo, thanks so much. And there are a number of follow-ups I'd like to ask, which I'll do in the next round. But let me, at the moment, bring in Eric Liu, a longtime friend of mine and a colleague and collaborator on many efforts. Eric is known for his very inventive work over decades now in the United States of trying to find practical ways to promote civic engagement and to repair the structure of democracy. So Eric, I'm just going to let you, here's a way I'll actually queue up the question for you about the state of democracy in the US and the works you're doing now. It strikes me that over the centuries, US democracy has relied on assumptions and norms that are not pushed to their maximum limit. We have a sort of flawed national system that requires some sense of compromise and reasonableness and not pushing things into the hilt. When somebody pushes them into the hilt, there are problems with the system. Tell us how you view sort of the state of democracy in the US right now. What are the most important efforts to shore it up or rebalance it?
Well, Jim, thank you for that question. And I hasten to add, we should make sure we leave some time for us to ask you the same set of questions, because you've been not just chronicling, but living it for many decades in journalism and government and the space between. I have to say, you know, anybody who reads your work at The Atlantic knows in very close detail, kind of real-time dispatches, just how fragile our national democracy is right now, how much the current occupant of the presidency is pushing norms to the limit and revealing the fragility of our institutions. And I don't think a whole lot more needs to be said about that. That is sort of the obvious backdrop of our time right now. What I will say, and what we've been saying in our work at Citizen University throughout, is to remind each other here in the United States that the president is not the country. I rebel against the formulation that you see in a lot of media coverage that Trump's America, or now Biden's America. It is not Trump's America. And that's not just because he's lost the presidency. It won't be Biden's America either, right? This is a really important thing, because I think the more mediated people's experience of democracy is, the more that people are going to be inclined to think this is the president's country, because we're all watching the president. And particularly when that president is just breaking stuff left and right, to the horror and delight equally of Americans, you know, it's a show that you can't take your eyes off in a certain way. But I think it's really important to remember the president is not the country. The country consists of people who are unsung, who are solving problems in, to use the title of the book that you and your wife, Deb Fallows, wrote, our towns. In our towns all across this country, well off the media grid and certainly off the national political conversation, are people who are just trying to figure out how to solve problems, how to deal with deindustrialization, how to deal with the opioid crisis, how to deal with gun violence, how to deal with the impacts of climate change, not debating it as some higher order talking point, but just actually figuring out, how is this going to affect the tourism industry in our community? How is this going to affect real estate values in our industry? How is this going to change the balance of power between native communities and tribal lands and the surrounding communities and so forth, right? And people just have to figure these things out. So that's thought number one. The president is not the country. But I think the other thing that is worth remembering that extends from that even is that the federal government is not the country. Now, certainly in the United States, and we've seen in the last 4 years, the federal government can be weaponized, can be used to affect either real change or the impression of real change that itself changes norms and gives permission to a whole bunch of folks to step out of the shadows and into the public square, whether those are neo-Nazis or white supremacists or what have you. But I think it's also important to remember that as much as we pay attention to the workings and the structures of national politics and the federal government, culture precedes structure. And this is foundational to our work at Citizen University. All we're trying to do is to foster a culture of powerful, responsible citizenship. We think of citizenship itself not in terms of documentation status, but in terms of a fusion of power and character, a literacy in power, where everyday Americans understand a bit more who decides stuff, how they can write themselves into the decision process, how they can change outcomes on the smallest local measures to the most pressing national ones. But to couple that literacy and power with a grounding in character, a set of pro-social virtues and values that cut against the grain of so much of what prevails in American life, which is a selfish hyper-individualism, right? Civic character is about remembering it's not all about you. And I think, we're living through this real-time experiment, not just through Trumpism, but through the pandemic and the ways in which even a basic common sense public health response to doing your part to be, neighborly or non-sociopathic in not spreading a virus is now politicized and polarized in a way where it becomes a badge of identity. And that is a diminishment of civic character, right? And so our programs, which we can talk more about as we go, are about teaching power and democratizing power. I love the way that, Elena, you were talking about all these ways in which, the fighting spirit, as you said, in Romania is there, and you're capturing that fighting spirit. You're a professional complainer, right? America is full of millions and millions of amateur complainers. And part of what we're trying to do is make sure that complaining doesn't just happen from my mouth to the screen that I'm watching, cable news or whatever, but that we channel that instinct to complain into the actual building of power, right? And so a big chunk of our programming is about teaching power, but the other part is about cultivating civic character, about rebuilding bonds of trust and affection and norms of mutuality and respect and rehumanization, which in our mass-mediated democracy, it's very easy to demonize and dehumanize people, and very easy just to sit in isolation, watch what you think is the show of democracy, and not know your neighbors next door, right? And so, so much of our work is about countering those trends and re-equipping people from the bottom up in our towns to revitalize democracy.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I'm going to have two sort of operational notes at this moment. One is quasi-operational or personal privilege, is to say how much I, as another American on the call, want to agree with and emphasize the point Eric is making about the disconnect between national governmental problems, which occupy 99% of the headlines in the United States, Trump's America, Biden's America, and the realities of American life, including civic life, which are quite different from that often, and which my wife Deb and I have been writing about. We've made a movie with HBO, which is going to be aired early next year, soon after the change in administrations, whose theme is exactly the one Eric is talking about, the ways in which there are examples of engagement all around the country. So that's a point of personal privilege. An operational point is that you can soon start sending in questions in the Q&A, because I have another round of engagement I want from our panelists, but you can feel free to start sending them in. I'm going to start again with you, Eric, on this round of questions, because there's a reason why I'm doing that. One of Ashoka's great principles is that we can learn from one another, we can evolve towards better practice, we can see what's worked in different parts of the world. You, Eric, have been crucially involved in an effort recently, even different from the one you discussed, to try to repair American democracy, which is this fabulous report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which you were the co-chair of, called, I believe, Our Common Purpose. And it had a number of very specific suggestions for repairing the idiosyncrasies of American democracy, the way the Supreme Court works, the way the House and Senate work. I'm wondering, in the spirit of sharing, when you were preparing that report, was there anything you could learn from other parts of the world? Did this American democracy, often so impervious to outside examples, or the ways in which you said, yes, we can observe what is happening in Australia, in Belgium, in Brazil, and elsewhere? How did the learning process work in this very ambitious report?
Thanks so much for that question, actually. This commission, which was created by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which itself goes back to John Adams in 1780, and the sense that in an emerging democracy, Elena used the word earlier that Romania is now entering into becoming a mature democracy, but that at the beginning, you need to make a commitment to building the institutions that are going to allow people to have the knowledge and be able to circulate knowledge in a way that will allow you to go from immature to mature. Or in the United States now, I think we're reverting from mature back to immature in our democracy. And so the work of an institution like the Academy, American Academy, is super important. We actually studied a lot of examples and exemplars from around the world, and you can find it marbled through the recommendations that we made in this commission. I actually have it. The report is called Our Common Purpose. You can just find it online. And there are we have a theory of action in this commission that to understand the reinvention of democracy requires you to see that there's a cycle, and it can either be a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle among institutions, civil society, and culture. Those three things, right? And when things are healthy and working, your institutions are trustworthy and they're working, and that feeds a sense of civil society feeling like it can actually participate in the institutions, and that creates a culture in which people feel like they ought to show up and feel like they ought to pay attention, right? And that's in Eastern Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall. You began to see that in Romania and elsewhere. You see that virtuous cycle taking hold. But in the United States right now, over the last several decades, this precedes the current president, you've begun to see a vicious cycle take hold, where institutions become sclerotic. They stop paying attention to people. That makes civil society become more zero-sum in its thinking and more polarized and more antagonistic toward other citizens. And that creates a culture of just scorched earth, take no prisoners. This is not a game of infinite repeat play, but this is a life and death thing in which we must capture our gains and hold them forever. And so in studying what was going on around the world, some of the recommendations are, for instance, for universal voting, a mandatory requirement, an expectation that if you're a citizen, you should vote. Just like if you're a citizen and you're called to jury duty, you should serve. And we looked at places like Australia that have been doing mandatory voting with great success for some time now, and understanding that it's not a silver bullet, but it is part of setting that virtuous cycle in motion. We looked at places in Eastern Europe, frankly, Romania, where on the culture side of the equation, and this is where Citizen University, where our work lives, the fragility of faith in democracy, right? Democracy works only if enough of us believe democracy works. And that's a magical, ethereal thing, which you take for granted when things are chugging along. But when it starts to degrade, you realize how difficult it is to recreate that faith. And in our work at Citizen University, we try to rekindle that faith by literally using the metaphor of civic religion. We have these gatherings called Civic Saturdays that are a civic analog to faith gatherings. We've created a civic seminary program to train catalytic people from all around the United States to create these gatherings that invite people not to fall into line with a dogma or a hardcore indoctrination, but to recognize that faith in democracy requires this willingness to question what Ronaldo was talking about in kind of massively participatory questioning of precepts and premises. And to be able to say, I have a voice in this. I should be able to express my doubts and my fears and to say them out loud and to mesh them in with those of others. And that kind of culture is a matter of habit and norms and practices. It can then be buttressed by institutions. And so another one of the recommendations in this report for Our Common Purpose is about boosting participatory budgeting, participatory forms of engagement. And as Ronaldo can tell us, participatory budgeting was born in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, and the ways in which that movement spread worldwide was kind of encapsulated by some of the early proofs of concept in Brazil. And so I think whether you're talking about institutional things like voting, questions of culture and belief and creating rituals for people to rekindle a sense of we're in this together, or forms of participation, we try to look all around the world, both in the Commission and in our work at Citizen University.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm going to ask both Elena and Ronaldo about this question of cross-cultural learning and sort of in your own processes, in your newer democracies, things you have learned from elsewhere and how you think people might learn from you. Elena, let me ask you, you had, as Eric was saying, a very culturally optimistic presentation of what Romania has been able to do. Was there any place you consciously learned from? And are there things you think people should be learning from you right now and extending more broadly beyond Romania's borders?
I think that the entire eastern part of Europe has something to share as a story about, giving up at some points and then regaining hope and then trying again and then losing some people in this process, because most of the countries in this part of Europe have lost a numerous part of their population. A lot of people, like in Romania, almost a quarter of the population has emigrated. They all went west, because this is also one of the big lessons to learn as an activist, as someone trying to push people towards civic engagement. That yes, it is about enough of us caring about democracy in order for it to thrive, but it's also about the fact that we should be aware that for some people time is of essence. A lot of the people from our region decided at the beginning of the 90s, right after the revolution, that they cannot afford to wait for the public services to get better. They simply didn't have that time. And they left in Germany, they left for Italy, they left for the US. And we should acknowledge the fact that some people will need to have this, luxury of not having to wait so many years for good public services in their own countries. On the other hand, I must stress the fact that what is I think is really, really good about this region of the world is that we are some sort of cynical idealists, meaning that and excuse this link, but it might seem a bit forced, but it's about knowing exactly what goes wrong and being really, really pissed about it, and like, this cannot happen, complaining a lot about it, but then also knowing exactly how this could get better. That's where the idealism gets really, really handy. It's about not giving up, and it's about knowing exactly that it won't really become an amazing thing, an amazing democracy in just a few years. But I think that unfortunately, sometimes it takes quite a while to get to learn this lesson, that there are no miracles and there is no immediate happy ending. And actually, I don't think that there is a happy ending. It's this is bad news, or I don't know if it's bad news. It's like fitness, like physical fitness. Civic fitness is also something that you should do on and on and on. And guess what? If you stop doing it on a regular basis, something bad will happen, and nobody will care about the fact that you worked for so many years before that. As for the cultural inspiration, I must share with you something that I already shared with the panel when we were preparing for this session. I was telling them that, because of the US elections, a lot of our European politicians started, complaining that, look at all these people, they know all the counties in Georgia, but they have no clue about how the European Parliament works. Well, not to put a lot of pressure on the US democracy, but it is something that people look at. And especially for, again, in Central and Eastern Europe, things are a bit more different. maybe because, you know, we have actually waited for the Americans to come for so many years. My grandfather died waiting for the Americans to come. He went through World War II, and there was, you know, this thought about the liberation that should come. There is, of course, the pop culture and everything surrounding the American inspiration in terms of democracy. And I think that, again, not to put pressure on you, because you have plenty of stuff to and plenty of issues to solve for your own. But there is a huge attention paid to whatever is happening in the US. And there is this sort of an expectation, I would say, for a moral stance of the US in some areas. I don't know if this can still be rebuilt. But I think that it's the attention paid to what is happening there, it's still there, and maybe it's something that you might consider nurturing in the future, because it inspired a lot of the people in these countries. Yeah, I'm going to get back to this maybe.
That is a really important point that I think many people in the U.S. are reflecting on now. I love your concept of cynical idealism, which is like something that Eric and I have discussed many times over the years, which is the difference between complacent optimism, the idea that things will get better, and conditional optimism, the idea that things can get better. You know, if you're engaged, which is sort of a sibling to your cynical idealism. So Ronaldo, I wanted to ask you on this learning question, a specific question, and then there's a number of really interesting things that have come in from the audience. I'll ask all of you, or from the participants. You were telling us about the constructive possibilities of technology for building engagement and democracy in Brazil. I think many North American and perhaps European listeners to that would be thinking of all the dystopian and destructive and fragmentary impacts that technology has been having recently in our societies, especially in news fragmentation, but in other ways too. What can the rest of us be learning from the constructive uses of technology in Brazil that might be of service in Europe, in Asia, in North America, towards building rather than destroying democracy with technological tools?
Sure, absolutely. So for once, I think it's important to mention that Brazil, like most of other democracies, have been suffering quite a lot with the use of technology as a form of basically manipulating or spreading disinformation and anger and, inflammation on the social tissue and so on. So this is something that happened in Brazil, and it's well documented since 2014. There are some amazing studies written since 2014 about the use of technology to spread what we call computational propaganda in Brazil. And of course, that has created a lot of problems and a fragmented public sphere in the country, polarization. I think we all know the playbook by now. But in spite of that, and having had this personal experience of seeing that technology can also be used as a positive force for participation, I do believe that Brazil has a pretty strong participatory culture. So I like that Eric mentioned about a participatory budget, which was indeed created in Brazil and adopted also in other countries as well. It has become like a sort of one of the most successful experiences in terms of basically decentralized decision making and building participatory channels for public policy decisions. And one point is that this fire has not been extinguished in Brazil, and it's pretty much alive. So on my personal side, I've been involved in quite a few projects that are basically applying those same principles. So one of them is the so-called Modamos Project, Modamos stands for We Change in Portuguese. And basically what it does is that it uses technology to make one provision of the Brazilian Constitution very effective. So the 1988 Constitution created a provision in which citizens could come together and sign a petition for introducing a law in Congress or in national, state parliaments or in city councils. So if you reach like 1% of the voters, you could basically create and introduce a draft bill in Congress. And of course, because you need to collect those signatures on paper, that was pretty hard. And basically it was used only 4 or 5 times in this many years since the Constitution. However, what we did was we created a blockchain-based application in which we would certify voters and basically allow them to use their cell phones in order to basically sign petitions. So basically, let me just share my screen really quickly because then you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the website for Modamos. And basically what it does is you download an app on your phone and it automatically and very easily certify you as a voter. And by means of the app, you can basically propose your own draft bill. And by doing that, you can propose a bill for your city, for your state, or nationwide. And other users of the app can basically look into your bill and basically vote on it. And if it reaches the number of votes that is required by the Constitution, 1% of the voters in average, basically you have your law introduced in Congress. And as a result, we've been able to basically draft and approve quite a few numbers of laws in Brazil. And just this year, we moved into a largest step. We took a biggest step, which is we created a nationwide platform that has to do with Brazil's FOIA laws. So Brazil has a Freedom of Information Act that is a federal law that grants citizens the access to public information. However, that law has not been regulated or passed at the city levels. So the green dots that you see here are the Brazil's municipalities in which FOIA laws have been actually introduced and enacted. And the red dots are the cities in which they still do not have a city level FOIA law. So what Modamos is doing right now is that if you live in one of these cities, you can come to this platform and click on your city, and it automatically allows you to introduce a petition for a FOIA law in your city in Brazil. So if other voters basically agree with your proposition, basically you have this very important tool in order to have nationwide impact. So these are 2 humble examples, but as I think, James, I think this fire has not been extinguished, and there's so much more we can do with technology.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much for those specific examples. I'm going to now combine and anneal several of the questions that have come in into sort of one final round to ask each of our panelists. And here's the premise that's come through several really fascinating questions from our other participants, which I'd summarize this way. You could think of the latter part of the 20th century as a time when many trends seemed to be favorable for democratization. There were new democracies being born. There was inclusiveness of various kinds that was expanding. There were new international organizations, et cetera, et cetera. In the last 2 decades, you can say there have been some contrary trends, and there are 2 of them that questioners mainly ask about. One is a sense of large numbers of people of being increasingly frozen out of the world economy. This has been a crucial factor in Brexit, of course, and in American politics and around the world. The other is the emergence in some modern, quote unquote, societies of what we would think of as kind of ancient sectarian divisions, where politics becomes like religion, and it's who you are with and who you are against, and it's not so much issues based, it's resentment based. Certainly that's been a major factor in the US now. It's a data point that the states with the highest pandemic infections cast the largest number of votes for Donald Trump. And that which is what you would think of in sort of sectarian terms, but not in personal interest, enlightened self-interest terms. So what are specific things that each of you would propose as measures to offset the threat to democracy from people who feel left out and people who no longer engage on principles, but just on resentments? Eric, I will start with you. What are specific measures from your work that you think can address these two fundamental world trends?
You know, our work starts from the foundational premise that you can't move on any of these big picture structural issues unless you rehumanize our political life. And so actually creating rituals, formats, spaces where people can rehumanize one another, can stop the habit and the reflex of demonization, and not necessarily come to agreement, but understand how did you come to this worldview? What shaped you? What formed you? And have better arguments, in a sense, right? I think that is the first foundational layer of this. And we've got projects. One's called the Better Arguments Project that we're running out of the Aspen Institute with the cooperation of Facing History and ourselves and the Allstate Corporation. But another, again, back to the Civic Saturdays I was describing earlier, the bet that we're making in trying to propagate this social technology, and they have spread all around the United States in rather short order, is that people are hungry to make meaning together. And they will, and for all the reasons that you're describing, globalization, big forces that make us feel small, that lead, you know, the kind of breakdown of prior boxes of place, status, and identity that lead people to grab onto sectarian ways of defining their story of self. The antidote to that is trust. The antidote to that is shared experience of meaning making and responsibility taking. And again, to do that, you got to turn off the TV. You got to actually turn off the screen after you're done watching this, and actually engage the people who live around you in community and who think differently from you, who worship differently from you, and so forth. And so our work at Citizen University is focused on that base layer of rehumanization. And our notion is that until and unless you do that, we're just going to have repeating cycles of reaction to these large global forces. If you do that base layer and then couple it with grounding in literacy and power so that people understand then how they can actually change things, and not just to give the middle finger of a vote to a populist presidential candidate, but actually how can I, even at the level of my town, my county, my state, make sure that we are better buttressed against some of these forces that are eviscerating our economy. That's a matter of responsibility taking that, again, your book, Our Towns, and the movie that's coming out next year based on it, tells a lot of stories of people doing just that. And that's our belief, that we have to multiply by many orders of magnitude that kind of commitment to each other.
Thank you very much, Eric. So Elena, tell us from your work, what are the practical steps you would recommend to people around the world in dealing with these economic exclusion and sort of and sectarian pressures in societies?
I'm going to make the cynical part of me speak first. It's not simple, and I think that it's counterintuitive, but unfortunately I don't think we can do this on a mass level. I think that we have already tested this with the digital tools help a lot, but I think that we need some sort of depth and some sort of empathy and some sort of kindness that cannot be scaled up so much, and some things need to be, and some people need to be, and their trust needs to be gained one by one. Retail politics is a good lesson also for the civic part of our life. I think that there will always be people that will be polarized, and that and people that will not want to get on board with what is good for, or the best possible option for the entire society. And I think that we should be also kind with ourselves and understand what is the limit of the resources that we are willing to invest. There will be some people that we will need to admit that we have failed, or that we cannot get on board in our projects. I don't mean by this that we should ignore them. I just mean that we need to use our resources where they are where they have the best impact possible. And then the idealist part of me says that I think that I don't know how to put this not to sound too bad, but I think that almost all countries had moments in which their citizens were ashamed of their government. I don't want to quote Germany and things like this, but yeah, think about it. We all had our issues. And I think that if we are fortunate and if we work really, really hard with learning our lessons, going deep into the data, trying to learn the others about their rights, about the legislation, about what they can do, we can count these years of backlash, of a shrinked civic space or shrinked space for democracy as just one of those, regular moments in which things are not so bright in our country. It's like in life, sometimes you get not so good days. So yeah, I think that this can be just one of those periods in which we are not at our best in terms of going forward with promoting rights for everybody, decent services for almost everybody, and so on. But we need to stay focused on this and be disciplined.
Thank you so much. And Ronaldo, you have our final thoughts here of specific steps that you would recommend from your work on these issues, on these pressures.
Absolutely, James. So one thing I think it's important is that we restore the possibility of dialogue in the public sphere. Right now, what we see is we have on one side, a certain position that comes up with a thesis. On the other side, another position that is an antithesis, but there is no synthesis. So there is no real dialogue that basically comes to a conclusion in the public sphere. And I think we can rebuild that. I think we can think of a public debate that actually leads to real argumentation, real exchange of ideas, and the capability of basically producing conclusions and solutions to go forward. So what we've been seeing in Brazil and many other countries is basically a fight for territory that is basically being fought with propaganda. So it's more a matter of occupying positions with a certain idea or a certain view, rather than basically engaging in a debate or advancing certain causes or values. And I think this can be reworked. And I think part of this rework, it lies on civil society groups. It lies on multi-stakeholder projects that basically involve not only governments, but the scientific community, the private sector, the third sector, and so on. And I am very enthusiastic of these multi-stakeholder efforts. And we have to remember that was possible. When we look to the history of the internet between 2002 to 2009, it was clearly possible. It was possible for people to come together and collaborate in large-scale projects like those, the construction of open source software like Linux, writing very sophisticated and comprehensive encyclopedia like the Wikipedia. And again, that has not gone away. These things, they are still amongst us. We still see like software developers collaborating on GitHub. We see designers collaborating in video game platforms. We see writers and researchers collaborating, for instance, to fight against the COVID-19 threat. We see researchers collaborating into deciphering genomics. And so these collective constructive projects, they are still with us, except in the political realm. Politics, for some reason, we kind of forgot about them. We let propaganda overtake them, and we forgot that it is possible to build together large-scale projects. And my idea is that it's possible to do that for politics as well. So these are some of the things I think we can fix.
That is fabulous. I'm going to send all of our participants back to the summit in just a second. I will say that Ashoka is all about calls to action and connections and ideas. And I think we've had some fascinating calls to action from Eric Liu in the realm of culture and ritual, from Elena Calistro in the idea of building the muscle of democratic engagement, and from Ronaldo Lemos in some of the practical ways in which technology can foster democratic engagement as opposed to, in addition to challenging it. So I've learned a lot. I hope you all have too. So thanks to Ashoka, thanks to our panelists, and we'll all work together to make a better democratic future. Bye from Washington.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.